it's a bigger section than just the 4 or 5 verses we'll look at. You really have to. But I do want to look at it in segments, not just verse by verse. So in verse 1, he said, and through verse 5 to begin with, I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Wot ye not what the Scripture saith of Elias, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so, then at this present time also there is a remnant, according to the election of grace. Now Paul has continued in this last couple of chapters to reaffirm to them that he is not opposed to the heritage of Israel. In fact, now he reminds them that he's what? He's part of it, right? He's been a part of that. And so he's trying to help them appreciate that he is not opposed to Israel at all, that he is part of that heritage. And so he reminds them of that. I'm an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a part of this heritage. And God hasn't cast them away. What he's asked them to do is come to who? Come to Christ. He hasn't said, I have no interest in you whatsoever. He hasn't said to them, I'm not concerned about you at all. What he said to them was, I want you to come to Jesus. And he uses a reference. He reminds them of the prophets and the destruction that many had come and the challenges that they had to face. And who does he use here in this text? Elijah, right? And what was it about? What?
He said he was the only one left.
Right. So he uses this imagery of Elijah. Remember, he had convinced himself that no one else was serving the Lord. I alone, Lord. Everybody's bowing their knee to Baal, and I alone am left to serve you. And what did God tell him?
7,000.
Yeah, there are thousands yet that had not yet bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone, Elijah. You're not the only one. You may be part of what? A remnant. You may be part of a remnant. Which is bigger, the whole or the remnant? W-H-O-L-E, by the way. Yeah, the whole, right? When you hear the word remnant, you automatically understand that he's talking about something smaller than the whole. And so he says there's been a remnant, but he said Elijah wasn't alone, but it was a smaller piece than just the whole of Israel. And maybe now, for those who are coming to Jesus, who are part of that heritage, maybe it is a remnant. And maybe it's not as large a portion as Paul would like, obviously, or that might be more convincing to the rest of the Israelites. But they still have opportunity to come. Even so then, at this present time, verse 5, also there is a remnant, according to the election of grace. There's still a portion, Paul says, of those who are honoring. And remember, he's also been trying to help them understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law. Yes, he brings in a new covenant, which means the old has to go away. Yes, he brings in a New Testament, which means the old has to lose its authoritative voice. All of that is true. But that was the intent and purpose of God all along. That's one of the messages of Paul throughout this letter. That was the intent and purpose of God from the beginning, to bring in a better covenant through his Son. But it doesn't dishonor that covenant. It doesn't dishonor that heritage or those people. Come be part of the remnant, Paul says. Come and be part of those who are appreciating the fulfillment of all that history founded in Jesus. Verse 6. And if by grace, then is it no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then is it no more grace, otherwise work is no more work. I'm going to leave that verse there for a moment, and we'll see it in the context in a second. But what do you think he's just trying to drive at there?
You can't do it. It's not just the works that you do that'll get you to heaven.
Yes. And what do you think? And he's emphasized that point before, that you're not going to work your way into heaven. Heaven is about grace and the unmerited favor of God. But what do you think he means by that phrase, otherwise work is no more work? What makes spiritual work beneficial?
When you want to do it.
Okay, so it has some of that level to it.
Even just doing works, you still need grace. You
Okay.
You have to have both.
Okay, so there's a need for both. That one doesn't necessarily annul or end the other, though salvation comes by grace and not by the works. I want you to think just for a moment about this idea that otherwise work is no more work. What makes spiritual action beneficial is that God prescribed it. If God doesn't give the instruction, we can do all kinds of works, right? We can do all kinds of actions and do all kinds of things, but they don't amount to spiritual benefit unless they're governed and given by the instructions of God. And so he says, if you're just working to work, you're not going to gain any real benefit from that. But when you honor grace, you work because of that grace. And you strive to honor God's will as it relates to that. What then? We can come back to that within the whole section here. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. According as it is written, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, unto this day. And David said, let their table be made a snare, and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, and bow down their back always. And so what do you think he's trying to remind Israel of?
That they should have heard and seen what was coming because of the scriptures and prophecies that were given before.
Okay, so they had prior knowledge of these matters, and they had been educated and taught concerning what was coming, and it should not have become a stumbling block, a snare, and a trap, but it had, because they chose to let it become that. What else do you see? What do you think about verse 7? How do you think somebody might react to knowing that the thing you've been attaining for and seeking, you didn't get, but the elect did? Who were the elect, by the way? He's already defined them throughout this letter. Those who have come to Christ, right? Elect are those who have come to Christ. And so he says, you've been trying to obtain something and have been trying to seek after something that really God has set in front of you, is saying you can have it if you'll become part of the elect. That's where the answer to what you're seeking is found. That's where the benefit to what you're seeking can be found. But they were choosing to ignore and to let it become a stumbling block to them. The spirit of what in them? Verse 8.
The
Spirit of slumber.
They're asleep to what they should be doing.
Yeah. You're not alert. You're slumbering through the message and the information. Eyes that should not see and ears that they should not hear unto this day. Your issue is you're not willing to see the honest truth that's revealed before you. Go ahead.
To remind us, of course, of chapter 10, verse 3, over there where it says, they being ignorant of God's righteousness, going about to establish their own, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God.
Yeah. And the reason and I think you go back to that idea that they had not sought after the knowledge of God that revealed to them. If they had just been honoring it from start to finish, then the message of Jesus should come clear to them and not be a stumbling block and not be a challenge. But their knowledge had been based in their own conceits and thoughts. Yep. Other thoughts. And so, in verse 9, he reminds them, David said, what? If they choose to let it be a snare or a trap or a stumbling block and a recompense rather than a benefit to them, then that's theirs to decide. If they choose that path, God's not going to forcibly make Israel go into a direction. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see. Bow down their back away. To me, what he's trying to drive at is that if Israel was expecting God to force them into a path that will ultimately bring salvation to them, he's not going to do it. If you want to let the message of Jesus be a snare and a stumbling block rather than a message to salvation, then you can make that decision. You can make that choice. And that goes for anybody, for that matter. Anyone has the ability to pick and choose whether they will decide to be a follower of Jesus or not. And God's not going to force their eyes open. He's not going to forcibly wake them up. He's not going to force upon them this message. They're going to have to come to it. They're going to have to come and seek the benefits that Jesus has offered. I say that have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation is what? It's come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now think about that for a minute. And remember what we've already kind of studied about how God purposes whom He will show mercy to and to whom He hardeneth, in that conversation that we've already had. But basically, Paul says here, God let you stumble. And that may seem like a detriment, but it's actually going to create a benefit. What's the benefit? The Gentiles are going to be allowed to come, right? So the Gentiles now are going to be allowed to come into Jesus. And the hope from that is that it will do what among the Jews? Yeah, provoke them to jealousy. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first, and also the Greek. That's Paul's theme statement, one of them in chapter 1 of this letter. The Gentiles are allowed in, and that result has various factors. The result of them being allowed in results in the fact that they now obviously have salvation. The ability for them to be grafted in means that they now have the opportunity to be part of the people of God just like anyone else. They become just as susceptible and to the rewards and benefits that God intends through Jesus as anyone. But to the Jew, it's also hopefully a motivator. That they'll look at that and say, look, we were once the people of God. We once had the privileges and benefits of being the children of God. And now these Gentiles are receiving the blessings because we refuse to seek those blessings in Jesus. And so Paul says this plan of God as it unfolds has various facets and purposes and reasons behind it. And the hope is that you'll get provoked to jealousy when you see the Gentiles receiving the blessings of being a child of God, and you'll want those benefits and seek them through the Savior. Now if, verse 12, the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify mine office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be, but life from the dead? For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. So Paul turns his attention away from the Jews now and begins to speak to whom? To the Gentiles. And he even qualifies himself as the what? I'm the apostle to the Gentile. He's the first one that will bring focus to Gentile areas. Who introduced the first Gentile to the gospel? That was Peter, right? Remember, that's Cornelius. In Acts chapter 10, we see Peter being the one who has to receive a vision to encourage him to realize that God is no respecter of persons. Then he should go and meet up with this man by the name of Cornelius, and he should preach unto him the message of the gospel. So it's Peter that brings the first time you see Gentiles converted to the gospel. It's Peter involved. It will become Paul, though, whose emphasis and work will find him in many Gentile locations. And in that sense, he will become the apostle of the Gentiles and the work and purpose that he has to fulfill in them. And notice he wants them he wants them to be careful not to become proud or arrogant against the Jews simply because God is now allowing them in. He wants them to recognize the privilege and benefit of that and not become too proud and return the arrogance maybe they had experienced from the Jews in return. He reminds them, I'm trying, your acceptance in is part of the plan that hopefully will not alienate the Jews forever, but hopefully will encourage them to come back, that some of them may be saved, he said at the end of verse 14.
Paul had the opportunity to tell the Gentiles this once before, back in Acts 13, if I remember. Lo, you have judged yourself unworthy, I believe he said, so we turn to the Gentiles.
Yeah. And that imagery doesn't really change throughout the New Testament, where an offer to the Jew first is extended, but not to the neglect of the Gentile world. Eventually it's okay. We've attempted to try to share with the Jew first, but the message still needs to get to the Gentile ears as well. And so he's hoping that this will provoke to emulation, right? He's hoping that as the Gentiles are being grafted in and they're coming to the Savior, that the Jews will see that and say, well, we need to emulate that. We need to perform that as well so that we might draw closer to God through Jesus as well. If casting them off, if casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from what? Life from death. They're not cast off in hopes that they'll never return. They're cast off in hopes that they'll learn something, right? They're cut off from the relationship with God because they've refused Jesus. Not because to be vindictive, not to be vengeful, but in hopes that they'll recognize what they have sacrificed and given up and that they will desire to come back. And if they do, that's life from the dead, he said. If they will come back, that's life from the dead. And so he will encourage that. So he tells the Gentiles, we're not casting them off forever. Don't think that Christianity has become to the Gentiles what the Jews made their relationship with God be under the Old Testament law. Don't think this is about making the Gentiles only the new people of God. That's not what it is. The Gentiles are welcomed in as the plan of God, but there's a function of that in hopes to bringing those fleshly Jews to reconciliation with God as well. And what picture does he draw in verse 16? Who are the first fruits that were holy? Those are Jews, right? So, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. Who originated? Who was part of the original plan of God and purpose? That was the Jews. Who were the promises made through? Those were the Jews. Was the plan of God holy when he said to Abraham and made those promises? Yes. Was the purposes of God holy throughout all of that heritage and history? Many, many individual and group failures along the way. But the plan and purpose of God was holy from the beginning. The challenge for the Jew is to recognize that the grafting in of these new branches, these Gentile branches, is not a grafting them into Judaism, but the fulfillment of Judaism. And I know I keep coming back to that, but that's really what Paul's been trying to get them to see. The new covenant in Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism. It's the completion of it. And so when the Gentiles are grafted in, Yes, they're grafted into Jesus, and it's a new covenant, a New Testament, a new. But it's all part of the entire plan that God had when He began to make those promises through Abraham way back here. That's why he can still say, when Paul writes to Galatia, and he says, if you be children, then you are Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. The connection is deeper. Sometimes maybe we think that the only connection to the spiritual heritage of God that the Gentiles have is to Jesus. That's not true. When they connect themselves to Jesus, He's the fulfillment of the entire plan of God, including that Old Testament, and so they become grafted in, a branch of a much larger plan and purpose that God had intended clear back in the days of Abraham. Jesus, again, is not merely a replacement, but a fulfillment of that Old Testament system.
Brian, don't you think some of the Jews back then had a very hard time accepting this and a very hard time to understand this, because they were Jews for hundreds of years and the Gentile was nothing to them. And then they're seeing these men grafted in. It's hard for us to understand right today, and back in Jewish times, I think it would be really, really hard to understand.
It's hard to understand in its specific, but I think the principle we understand it, because we have seen men hate other men for no real reason, and that tension is real. Let's modernize it for a moment. You can just go over into the Middle East right now, right? Conflict and hatred everywhere you look, that is ingrained in centuries of tumult and hatred. And then you come along and a new dignitary or a new government official, something, and they're going to fix hundreds of years. It's hard, right? It's hard to get folks to quit hating each other. When it's been entrenched in the mindset. Why does racism continue? Even in our own country, it continues because it's ingrained in the minds of people. And one generation to the next generation to the next generation share racist thought with their children and their children's children. And it just perpetuates itself. And it's hard. It's hard to come in and break the chain of decades and centuries of men hating one another. That's where they're at. You're exactly right. I mean, we see modern examples of how hard it is. That's exactly what Paul's asking the Jews to do. But here's, to me though, here's what I believe was the truth for them and is the truth today. Who is the great mediator between these hated factions? And specifically, Jesus. That's the message of Paul. Paul's message here is the great equalizer, the great mediator, the only one really, who can change this pattern of hatred. It's Jesus. That's Paul's message, and I believe it to be true as well. That not just for Jew, Gentile, but it's true in every circumstance where men hate one another. Now, the challenge is that even today, men hate one another over what they think about Jesus. that issue, they had it, we have it. It continues. But Paul is trying to beseech them. On one side, he tells the Jews, get ready, here come the Gentiles, and it was God's plan and purpose. And I hope it makes you mad. Because I hope it provokes a jealousy in you that makes you realize that you're abandoning your opportunity to be in relationship with God by rejecting Jesus. And then he turns this, you can almost see, here, talk to the Jews for a minute. Now I want to turn over here and I'm going to talk to the Gentiles for a minute. And he turns to the Gentiles and he says, listen, you've been benefited and blessed by this opportunity. Don't you dare think that somehow now you're better than the Jews. Because one of the purposes of allowing you to be grafted in is hopefully to bring the Jews from death to life in Jesus Christ. And so you see the oscillating fan approach of teaching when Paul begins in this context, as he begins to talk to both groups on both sides of this challenge. Any other thoughts? Verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Again, he's still talking to the Gentiles. And he tells them that, sure, and the grafting, apparently, of trees and things was not foreign to them. Folks do that today in modern times, where you try to graft and create a different hybrid. And so they apparently were common, or at least familiar with that concept. And he said, if you take being a wild olive tree, and you're grafted among those who came from the holy lump, if you will, the root, the plan that came through Abraham, if you be grafted in, what are you still dependent upon? The root. You're a branch in a system that requires the root. And so it wouldn't make much sense for the branch to be arguing with the root, because the root is where the sustaining life is coming from. And so he reminds them, you're still a branch connected to a root system that is entrenched in the history of the promises made through it. So don't boast about that. But if you boast, remember, you're not holding up the root's holding up you. And so he's warning the Gentiles, be careful. Just because God decided that some of his people, some of the Jews, needed to be broken off because they refused Jesus, allowing for room for you to be grafted in, doesn't make you better than anyone else. And notice he said, verse 19, thou wilt say then, the Gentiles might say this, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off. And thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. God didn't take a good branch and snap it off and toss it aside and say, well, I needed room for the Gentiles, so sorry guys, you're pretty good and you're believers, but I need room. And so he snaps off that branch and no, he said they were broken off because of what's called unbelief. They weren't broken off randomly just so that there'd be room to bring you guys in. He says they were broken off because of unbelief. And so don't be high-minded as if, well, we're so much better than the other guy, so God took that guy away and gave us his spot. He said, no, they earned, if you will, the situation of being broken away because of their unbelief. Don't be high-minded. Thou standest by faith. Faith is what allows you to be grafted in. Their unbelief is what caused them to be broken off. And again, a warning to the Gentiles who are receiving Jesus to be careful how they react and respond. Jews, you're going to have to welcome in the Gentiles. Gentiles, don't look down with disdain towards the Jewish Christians, because you're all going to have to be part of one body. You're all going to have to be part of the body of Christ and function and work together in that situation. So warnings all the way around. The bulk of the letter so far has been warnings towards Jews and how they need to rethink Jesus and other issues. Now he comes back and wants them to appreciate, the Gentiles to appreciate the privilege that it is. And he reminds them what in verse 21?
Did not spare the branches.
If God spared not the natural branch, right? If God decided that he wasn't, that he could decide that, that branch isn't working out so well, or this situation isn't working out so well, so I'm gonna take that branch away. He could do that with who? Yeah, he'd take the grafted branch away as well. So Gentiles, don't think that you're grafted in permanently. God's already proven that he's willing to take a natural branch and move it aside. He can also take a grafted in branch and move it aside if we refuse to honor him. If he wouldn't spare the natural ones, then don't think for a minute that he would bring judgment down against the branches that were grafted in. Verse 21 or 22. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Summation, don't take anything for granted. You're allowed to be grafted in, but it may not be permanent. If you choose to walk away from God in unbelief, you can be removed from the root system, just like the Jews who were in unbelief removed themselves from the root system through unbelief. All right, I'll come back to that thought, and we'll finish this chapter, Lord willing, on Wednesday.